Welcome everybody. Day 2 of the general session. I hope everybody's had a great time. So we're going to be speaking about the sort of accidental administrator's guide. So this is not a deep dive into sort of hardcore enterprise scale administration. This is more for probably you sort of just, you've just been made in charge of the Power BI sort of environment, right? Okay, so with that said, my name is Michael Johnson. I'm a principal consultant at Cobalt Analytics. It's a small little consulting company in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is where I'm from. I'm a data platform MVP. I wrote a book on Pro Power BI administration with Azure Gunnison. Did anybody go to Azur's talk yesterday? So that's obviously a nice segue. So you got the first 4 chapters yesterday. You'll get the next 5 chapters today. It's not quite related to the chapters, but the content, that's sort of how we did it. Twitter handle is Mike Johnson ZA. Okay, so what are we going to speak about today? Really, it's keeping it simple. We're just going to have a quick overview of governance. This is not a governance talk, but without governance, or some sort of governance, there is no administration. Okay, there's just clicking buttons. Okay, then obviously we'll look at some of the administration stuff, and then we're going to have a look at how you might automate some of these tasks. Okay, so when it comes to governance, really, when Power BI sort of started out, there was no guidance on governance. In fact, it was actually the complete opposite. Microsoft started Power BI as a sort of shadow IT, sneak it in via the back end. So what we found is a lot of the Power BI tenants actually began in a very unmanaged way. So more recently, Microsoft have begun to start putting this sort of adoption framework policies together, and they've called this the Power BI Adoption Roadmap, and it speaks about 10 key things. We'll just have a look at these very quickly. The first is really data culture, and that's how your company regards data, right? If you have no intention of letting people explore and play with data and come up with their own deductions, then something like Power BI is not necessarily the tool for you. It's about enabling users to create and enrich their own sort of work lives. Okay, and key to that is executive sponsorship. We're really going to be quick over these things. I've got the link at the bottom if you'd like to go and read more. Okay, it is a good read. So Melissa Coates and Matthew Roche really put those together. So executive sponsorship, we need somebody important to make sure that there is enough authority for these things to happen. Then we speak about content ownership and management. And are we talking about enterprise BI? Are we talking about self-service BI? And that has some important sort of implications about how we manage things. Okay, in a very self-service world, the role of the administrator is going to be less, okay, versus in a highly organized, rigid sort of enterprise. We might have a full-time administrator or even a team of administrators, right? Okay, then we speak about content delivery and scope. So who's generating content? Is it departmental? Is it a team BI? Is it enterprise BI, organizational BI? Then we've got a center of excellence. And that's just a collection of people who kind of help shape the way Power BI is used. And an important sort of output of that is the governance framework, right? So that governance framework will then decide what policies we are going to create around BI, and this is what the administrator is going to be responsible for implementing, right? So if we don't understand how that governance is going to be put in place, what policies we put in place, how do you know what settings? Now there are some settings that are, I think, fairly obvious, some settings that perhaps not so. Okay, then we've got a couple of other ones, mentoring and user enablement. We've got community of practice, user support. Remember the user support, we'll get back to that in a second, as an example of something that comes out of governance that drives the way we do the administration. And then finally, what Microsoft call system oversight, but the rest of us call the administration, right? So this is where the rubber hits the road, and we actually going to then go and implement that. Any questions on this? This is not an admin course, but we can obviously I will have a look at that. If you'd like, you can type questions into the Canopy app, and we'll get to those. I'll try to answer them as they come up. We don't have to hold questions till the end, right? Again, so onto the administration section. Okay, sort of the way I see it, there's sort of 6 key areas of administration. The first is the tenant, okay, and the tenant is that containing body. There's capacities, if you have them, but there's always at least one capacity. There's the users, there's the workspaces, artifacts, and when we speak about artifacts, these are the data flows, the reports, the paginated reports, whatever those are. And then there's data. Specifically, how do we refresh it? We're not talking about the development, okay? Lots of sessions on that, but this is just more about how we manage that data. Okay, we're going to begin with the tenant. And a tenant, very simply, is a container, okay? And when you begin to use Power BI, it actually goes, or the very first time somebody in your organization interacts with Microsoft, it goes and creates this tenant. Okay, now I spoke about Power BI being a, coming in via the back door. What do they call it? There's an actual, not quite a Trojan horse, hopefully. That's more of a virus. But yes, so basically shadow BI, right? Or shadow IT, right? So this is when users start installing their own stuff. It's not enterprise pushing this tool down on you. So if you think about how Click or reporting services came, nobody installed reporting services, right? Or user. It was an IT initiative. Power BI went the other way. It was very popular, and people just started using it. And if you were the first person in your organization to ever connect to Power BI, it created this shadow tenant, right? This unmanaged tenant, okay? But, how do you control that? Okay, so the first thing you actually need to do is to understand who actually owns your tenant. And it comes with a couple of things. It comes with a name, okay? So it'll be something like xyz.onmicrosoft.com. That'll be your company name. You may or may not get your company name. It's fine. You can actually give it a more DNS appropriate name, okay? Chances are this isn't going to be you, but if you're a small company, maybe you do need to take control of that tenant. And with that tenant comes Azure Active Directory, right? And that backs everything. This manages identities and also the roles. Okay, so there's three key roles that we have in Power BI, right? There's the global administrator. He can do everything, okay? Honestly, you probably shouldn't have that access. Maybe if you're a little five-man shop, you do, okay? But ideally, that is something that is actually held back, and more appropriate roles, such as the Power Platform Administrator or the Power BI Administrator. So those are the three roles that you would need to manage a Power BI tenant. Okay. Now there's a policy or there's a concept called like sort of just in time, where instead of being assigned these roles full time, perhaps what we rather do is when I need to a sort of role, or I need to be assigned a role for this, I get assigned that for a short time, and then that gets taken away. That can be done manually or through Azure Active Directory if you actually have the correct tier. Okay, Tenant's not just made up of Power BI though. It comes up with a lot of things. It comes with Azure. Azure, you're hearing a lot of everywhere else. That is all consumption-based. Obviously, we're looking more at the Office and Dynamics kind of tenant, where everything is license-based, and more specifically, most of it is PPU, right? Or per user, per month kind of pricing. There are caveats to that, right? Where we actually get capacity licensing, we'll discuss that in a second. But there's a whole bunch of products that could fit under that. So Microsoft 365, Power BI. There's also Power Apps, part of that Power Platform family, right? So that Power Platform Administrator, you would be in charge of both of those things. Okay. And then there's a whole bunch of things, so we're not going to speak about them. Questions on any other things on the tenant, right? Okay. So in addition to the roles in the tenant, there is a couple of other tenant settings that we want to look at. So if I come into my Power BI tenant, and this is my demo tenant, so it's not going to be especially exciting, especially when we get to the utilization reports. I don't use this tenant, so there's like almost no usage, but we'll walk you through it. So in order to get to the admin tenant, you're going to come to this little ellipses. You've got the settings tab. Then we've got the admin portal. So there's a couple of settings. Well, there's a whole bunch of options, and we'll have a look at some of them, but we're most interested in the tenant settings. And we're going to look at the first one right now. Okay, so that is this publish help. We spoke about how one of that ninth step was, user support. Okay, and this is important for organizations. If you're a little company, chances are you don't have a dedicated support capacity. So you're actually going to want to default to the Microsoft channels. It's going to take you to the Microsoft forums. It's going to take you to the Microsoft docs. If you're a large enterprise, what you're actually going to want to do is enable this feature, and I can then go and dictate exactly where my users get routed for their training needs, for their discussion forums. Maybe you have a Slack channel or a Teams channel, something like that. You've got licensing requests. I build a nice little Power Automate flow for that. My help desk, I should have some sort of internal ticketing system. Okay, so this is really your company dependent. It's not something that Microsoft can dictate to you directly, right? Okay, so that's one example of a tenant setting. The next one I'm going to look at is something like create workspaces. Okay, so the create workspaces option dictates or informs us who can go and create workspaces. Now, we spoke about there being organizational BI and self-service BI. So in a very organizational-driven approach, we don't want to let anybody just go and create workspaces, right? Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of duplicate workspaces, a lot of unsecured workspaces, and just a lot of workspaces in general, right? So we want to limit that. But even within the self-service capacity, maybe we want some sort of central IT function. That's just the IT guy. He goes and creates the workspace, and then the business takes care of the content within that. But generally, we don't want to allow everybody to go and create a workspace. You can imagine what would happen with an organization of 10, 100,000 users. Each person creating 10 workspaces, that is, that would be unbearably slow, actually. All right, sorry, there was a question.
Michael, on the first section with the URLs.
Yes.
Where does that information appear later on down the line?
Okay, so the question is, in the sort of URL options, where would these sort of settings appear? Throughout the portal, there's always a get help kind of features. It would replace those get help features. So instead of taking you to Microsoft Forums, it would take you to your Slack channel. So yeah, cool. Okay, the last one I'm going to look at is, and I need to type this one because it's always down at the bottom. Okay, so what we're going to look at is how to automate some of these tools just now, and that's using the sort of what's called the APIs, okay? And the APIs allow us to programmatically interact with it, but we actually need to enable this feature. So we can also determine who can actually access this. So as an example, because we actually haven't played with one, so I'm just going to open it up. You can see that we can turn that feature off if we don't want it at all. Maybe we're very paranoid. We know there's going to be no, or there should be no automation. And if there is automation, it's probably a bad actor. Maybe we turn it off, okay? But if you're a large organization that is automating, we do need to enable it. And then we can control who does this. Now, we don't want to be doing this on a per user basis. Nothing in Power BI should really be done at a per user. We should be using security groups for everything. So you can put in a security group here. So I think I have a Power, if I could spell Power BI, and then okay, so I have like a Power BI embedded app group. So all my apps go into that group, and then those groups can then access. So this is a general sort of good practice. It makes it a lot easier to understand, because when an auditor or somebody wants to know who has access, well, I can just go and show them who has access to the group. Okay. Questions? None. Okay. All right. Head on back to that. Okay. So that was the tenant. The next thing is the capacities. And there's two types of capacities. We've got the shared capacity, which is the bit that Microsoft takes responsibility for, and you are probably most familiar with. If you have a Power BI Pro license or a free license, you are on that shared capacity. You don't know anything about the underlying resources that sit underneath that. But if you're a large organization, perhaps I need some of the features that come with a dedicated resource, and a lot of those are now available through PPU licensing. We'll discuss that in a second. But perhaps I need large models, okay? Perhaps I need guaranteed isolation in some way, okay? And that's where capacities might come in. So you can purchase capacities in one of two ways. You can purchase them through the sort of Office 365 tenant. So these are something like a premium capacity. We call these a P1, P2, P3. I think the P5 is the largest. And they start, but they're not cheap, $5,000 per month, okay? Now, the advantage to this is that you can put as many people on this thing, as Eugene Madinger, like his analogy is that a Power BI Pro license is like buying a ticket on a bus, and a premium capacity is like buying the bus, right? Now, you can put as many people on that bus as you want, but we all know that eventually that becomes pretty uncomfortable, so you probably need to buy a second bus. Okay, so management of capacities is somewhat restricted because you don't actually get access to the underlying machines. It's a fully abstracted sort of a PaaS implementation. So I have this. I can play with some of the settings, but I don't get a ton of settings. I'm just going to return back to my Power BI portal. Now, because I don't have $5,000 a month to show you, I have a. I'm just going to discard those settings. I have a Power BI embedded, so that is purchased through Azure. The nice thing about that is I pay per second, right? So I turn it on, and you get to the end of this demo, I'm going to turn it off. It only costs me, 1 hour's, and it's like nothing. It's like $1. Okay, so that's it. It's a real cheap way to experiment with some of these features. So you can see I have this one capacity, and I can go and fiddle with some of these options. First one is the capacity usage report, which is really important because now I'm responsible for the resources on this thing. How do I know if I'm using up all my CPU? How do I know if my models are too large? How do I know how often it's being used, okay? And that capacity app is how you're going to do that. So you just go to App Source, it installs a little capacity app, and I'll show you what that looks like. So it's right there, okay. Now again, remember I mentioned I don't actually use this tenant, so don't be shocked if you don't see anything, but you'll see that that's basically what your, okay, it's really going to show you nothing, okay. But you would then see CPU usage, sort of refreshes, errors, all of this sort of information that you as an administrator would need to be sort of watching. Okay, back into admin tab. Boop. Okay, and we were doing capacities. Embedded. Okay. We got a couple of other sort of settings that we've got. Notifications. So should I be notified when the CPU is above this percentage for how long? What sort of happens? We can actually set auto scale, right? So auto scale is something that came with Gen 2, where I can actually get it if it is under load. Make it bigger, right? Everything in Azure we're seeing is going that way. So then you get that real-time response to demand. And that's really nice because instead of having to go buy a P2 for, for another month, we can just get it for maybe month end, right? When there is that load that actually needs it. A couple of other settings. We can sort of enable certain workloads, specifically things like enabling the XMLA endpoints. You can also enable the sort of AI functionality, and then paginated reports is also another feature. So you can determine what sort of resources are made available to those features. Okay. Questions on capacities? No. Okay. Next one, users. Okay, so we're going to be speaking about users. Yes.
I have a question for the premium capacity.
Yes.
Split those into the workspaces.
Okay, so the question is, what do we do with capacities? So a capacity is just a set of resources, but we will then assign those resources. So let me show you roughly what that looks like. If we come into the portal, you'll see that on a workspace, okay, so I've got a couple of workspaces here. I'm just going to open up a Pro workspace, okay, and we've got a little settings tab, and we'll discuss this when we get to settings, but I can actually assign the workspace to the capacity. So I can assign as many workspaces as I want to that capacity. And generally what you might do with that is you might, let's say a particular division within your company, so let's say finance purchased this capacity, they would then migrate all of the finance workspaces onto that capacity. Okay.
Do you split like only the users or also the storage?
So storage is somewhat abstracted from you, so you don't know that. So you would assign, so it depends on exactly the model that you take, but you can have a whole bunch of vCores assigned to you, and you can break that into two or more, or well, one or two or more sort of capacities, and then you can assign workspaces to those. So you might buy 8 cores divided into two sets of 4, and then so you can do that sort of manipulation, right? Okay. So where were we? Okay, users. So as I mentioned earlier, right, you're going to be, you don't necessarily want to be assigning users individually. So a lot of what we're going to actually do is manage users through groups. But if we come, a lot of the conversation around users really revolves around licensing. So let me just start that up again. Shift F5. Okay. All right. So Power BI license is often, it's complex, but it's not, okay? And I appreciate it's getting more and more complex by the day. When it started out, it was really easy. Okay, so we have 2 ways that we can license people, okay? We can license users individually, okay? And we can license capacities. So we spoke about how we provision those capacities. And with the users, we get 3 types of users, right? So we get a free user. So this is somebody who's not paying. Now, Microsoft allows you to actually use Power BI without paying, but then you only have access to your My Workspace, right? So this is like a little folder that's specially for you, but in general, nobody else can actually access that. Okay, there are legacy ways to do that, but it's not already a supported feature and it's discouraged, right? A free user can be used for a little one-man company, okay, but it's also used for capacities. So if I'm going to use let's say I bought a capacity and I intend to have 1,000 users, I would then license those 1,000 users as free users, and that can be done automatically, and then those users would then be able to access the capacity. There are caveats to that. In order to publish content, you would still need a pro license, okay? So, even with capacities, you can expect at least one pro license in your organization, okay? And that pro license is there. And that's a very simple model. It's basically $10 per month, okay? Standard licensing, there's no such thing as a developer license, a consumer license. It's just $10 per month. So when we buy that capacity, just as a bit of a metric, if it's $5,000, you would expect that when you get to 500 pro users, that is kind of the point at which a capacity might be tempting from a financial perspective. There are obviously other reasons to consider one or the other. Now, there were a lot of people who had a bit of pushback. They weren't big enough to afford a capacity, but there were a lot of features that we wanted. Large models, paginated reports, that they wanted access to this, but they didn't want that capacity. So Power BI sort of created or Microsoft created another user license called the Premium per User. So this costs $20 per month, and basically comes with almost all of the premium features. Okay, so now you've got those things like, I'm going to say paginated reports, but that actually is now available in Pro, deployment pipelines, large models, or larger models. All of those kind of things are available on this PPU model. Okay. And then just to wrap up the capacities, we have the P SKUs. So those are the premium SKUs. We've got EM SKUs, which are slightly different. Those are really for embedding within other Microsoft applications. So if you're using things like Dynamics, this is a way that you can license your Power BI sort of reports, but it's really meant for an embedded scenario. And then A SKUs are really meant for the embedding. So if you have a custom web application that you would like to include Power BI reports in, you would use something like A SKUs to enable that. What's really nice about that method is that it decouples Power BI access from the Azure Active Directory. So you've got your own authentication process, so you can actually have unauthenticated access or your own custom authentication. But users won't be able to go in via the apps.powerbi.com, right? The portal, the thing that we've been looking at. Questions on any of that premium stuff? We'll have a look at how those access quickly. Okay, so we've got a couple of workspaces. We spoke about the My Workspace, so that's the one that everybody gets assigned. We get a Pro workspace. Okay, so this is a workspace that got created by somebody with a Pro license, and and those go into the shared capacity, or those are Pro features. And then we've got that shared capacity where we've got this new PPU sort of option, and then we've got the dedicated capacity with premium-backed workspaces, right? And then we've got the three little license types. So just to explain, very simply, a free user can access their My Workspace. They can't access the Pro Workspace. They can't access PPU, but they can access the Premium Workspace, right? Pro users can access the My Workspace. The Pro Workspace cannot access the PPU-backed workspace and can access the Premium Workspace, okay? And the Premium per user users can access everything. Just something to remember is if you've got a PPU user accessing a Premium-backed workspace, you're essentially paying the premium price twice. Okay. Same thing kind of happens when the Pro user's there, but you do need that Pro user for the Premium-backed workspace for the creation of content. Questions on licensing? Or does everybody understand licensing nowadays? For what? An A1 SKU is $700 per month.
Could we actually have a PPU-backed workspace and assign that to the application ID? Then that's only $20.
Huh? Yeah, it wouldn't be support. So the minute you're going into that app owns data scenario, there is no concept of those workspaces. You actually administer everything through the workspaces in the back end, but it's all through normal Power BI licensing. If I get that. Okay, and the question was, can I use if I'm going to use Power BI embedded? Can I then put a PPU workspace inside of that embedded capacity? Is that? No. Okay, so Microsoft wouldn't support that. You couldn't use the PPU backed workspace to use that. You can do that in a premium workspace, though. Okay. All right. Okay. So workspaces. Workspaces are conceptually very simple. They are just containers where we put things. You can think of those as folders. Okay. And most importantly, it dictates security, because everything within Power BI works on a workspace level. So we don't have assigned permissions per report, per data set. Okay, there are caveats to all of that, but generally we work at the workspace level. So when we create a workspace, that's all very simple. Okay, so we've got the Workspaces tab. You can see we've got a list of workspaces. We've got 3 types of workspaces, right? So the first is the Pro workspace, and you can see that it doesn't have any sort of symbol over here. Okay, so that's how you know it is a Pro workspace. They don't call them Pro workspaces, right? They're just workspaces. Okay, then we have a PPU workspace, and you can see that's denoted by this diamond with the little user. Okay, and then we've got a premium back workspace for our content. There's a couple of important settings within each workspace. Okay, the first one is the access control. So we spoke about how you would assign. Now you can see that I've done what I told you we shouldn't. I've assigned a user to this workspace. Generally what we would want to do is go and do something like create a group called Power BI Administrators. There you go, okay. And then I would assign a collection of users to that group and then replace it. And this really becomes important, because what happens when that administrator leaves or changes role? Can you imagine opening up 10,000 workspaces and replacing one user? Now, I'm going to show you how to do that more efficiently, but we shouldn't do that in the first place, okay, with groups. Okay, so generally that's how we want to manage. And there's a couple of role types, right? The first role type is the administrator role. And administrators can do anything within the workspace, including delete it, okay? Then we get a member, and a member can do almost everything that an administrator can do. They just can't create other administrators, right? So you can actually add other users, you can add content, you just can't go and create more administrators. Okay, a contributor is probably the role that you would expect most of your dev team to assume. So these are people who can create content, but cannot create other users. And then finally we have viewers, and viewers are the people that we intend to be able to view content. Now the viewer role is really important, especially when we get to things like row-level security. Row-level security is only applied to users in that viewer role. So maybe you spend a lot of time getting your row-level security right, but you make everybody contributor. Doesn't matter, they can see all the data, right? Okay. Yeah, so that is the Access tab. Then we get the Settings tab. A couple of important options here. Obviously, we've got a name. We want nice, usable names. Okay. We've also got a nice option of creating logos. Some of my clients, what they do is they create a different logos for their dev, UAT, and prod environments. Okay, but maybe you have logos that might be specific to clients. So if you have a workspace per client, you want to put their logos on that. You can use that image or the names in some useful way. There's a couple of limitations on these names, right? You'll notice that the portal, when you actually come into that portal workspace, which has changed a bit, so maybe it's not going to, but there's a limited length. Okay, I used to have a nice workspace called, no, I've deleted it. But basically, I just made that name as long as I could, and you actually can't see the back end of that workspace. So if you want to put the important bit of the name towards the front, I know that might sound kind of weird, but what you don't want to say is dev, workspace, finance, and then the project name, right? Because nobody's going to see the project name because it's actually on the far end, okay? And that's just more of a tip than a rule, okay? So that's on the settings tab. We've obviously got descriptions. Everything should have a description, so we, as well as other people, understand the purpose. We've got a couple of advanced tabs, okay? So we can set the workspace administration settings. You can hook it up to OneDrive. We're not really going to speak about those two, but the premium option is, this now leads to your question. How do I assign a workspace to one of these premium capacities? So I can open up the premium tag, and I get a choice. I can leave it in pro mode, okay, which means that it's in that shared capacity. I can assign it to the premium per user group, okay, and you'll see there's two new options that have appeared. I can choose the default storage format. So how do I want to store files within that? And that's to enable larger models. And I also get this workspace connection. And that's really important. It comes back to that XML endpoint we spoke about. So I can actually use other tools. I can use something like Management Studio or Excel or something to actually go and connect to the backend, because it's all tabular in the backend, right? It's a Power BI or an analysis services tabular model in the backend, right? So I can go and connect to it directly. So that makes working with tools as DAX Studio a lot easier. Okay, so the question is it only premium users? No, the PPU users can also use it as well.
Yeah, but it's only the
PPU or premium, yes. Not in the Pro. So that's one of the sell features. At least I think that's still true. The problem with Power BI, they change stuff all the time. I mean, it's fantastic, but it's also a little bit nerve-wracking when you're presenting it, right? So that might not be true. Okay, so we can choose, and then when we get to the embedded, you can see that we can actually choose the embedded instance. I've obviously only got that single option, but I would then be able to select which, because again, different departments would then purchase different capacities. Now, when you actually create these capacities, you also assign users who can assign workspaces to that. Really important, because you don't want people from outside of your business division being able to assign resources to your workspace. Okay. And then just Azure connections. So this is just when we use data flows, okay, data flows actually allow us to essentially you get to build this like a sort of ETL process, and by default those files land in the CDM format. Okay, the common data model. It lands, but within the MicroStart environment, and you don't actually have access to it except for through the Power BI portal. But if you wanted to augment that, maybe you wanted to use something like Spark or something to actually modify some of those files, you could actually then set that to store those files within your own lake. So you would assign your own storage account, and then you would be able to manipulate those files further. So if you need a way to actually access some of these models not through Power BI, this might be a way of doing it. Okay. What's that? I don't think that. Okay, so the question is that ability a premium only feature? I don't believe so. No. Okay. Any other questions on users? No. Okay. Okay, artifacts. So when it comes to artifacts, it's not really the role of the administrator to manage the artifacts. That is the role of the dev team, right? So the artifacts are the actual reports, the actual data flows, paginated reports. In a small organization, perhaps you are the same person, so you might be doing it, but in a segregated environment, it wouldn't be your responsibility. What would be your responsibility is making sure that those artifacts conform to certain principles. When it comes to report design, maybe we have a policy that we don't allow something like direct query. Okay, maybe we have naming standards. Maybe we have security rules, right? Everything must have row-level security enforced. Maybe we have standards on the way on what we connect. Everything must come, from our source systems into a data flow, and then Power BI only reads from the data flow. Whatever those policies are that you've developed, okay, and I'm not saying that any of those things I just said is right and wrong, you would then want to ensure. Okay, so the question is, how would you then go and monitor that? And there's a couple of ways we can do that. Within a workspace, you'll find that there is within a report tab, we can go and see, one of the most common questions as an administrator you can ask is, are people actually using this? Okay, and the first way you're actually going to do it is by opening the model that cannot be loaded. I'm not going to try and debug that. I'll just go straight to another workspace. Who thinks that one's going to work? I'm doing terribly in my Fantasy League demo. Okay, all right. So you can see that we've got options to actually go and determine who's actually using this report. So we've got these open usage matrices. So this will then go and determine or give us a little sub-report. See, it's going to calculate. And this is going to tell us who's using our report. Because one of the worst things is when you actually go and develop a whole bunch of Power or BI reports and nobody actually uses the things. So it's important to understand how usage works. Now this approach is absolutely fine for a small enterprise that maybe just has 2 or 3 reports and gets that understanding. We're going to show you how you're going to do that at an enterprise scale just now. Okay, but you can go in and get a sense of how many people. And it looks like I used this report once. I told you I didn't use this tenant too much. You can get some stats on sort of report performance. Is this slowing down over time? Because one of the things we find is as more and more data is added to our model. That common thing, right? It works in dev because they only had 5 rows and then they published it and we loaded up 10 million products and turns out that cross-apply wasn't a good, or that cross-join wasn't a good move. So these will give you some stats on your report usage. There is another report usage model and I don't actually see this used much. So within the tenant, you've got some more usage matrices. Again, very high level, right? It'll tell you basically what are the most common used reports in your model and who is using it. So that's going to give us some basic stats, okay? We're going to talk about the APIs just now. So we can actually get row level or detailed level information as to who's accessing what, when they're accessing it, where they're accessing it from, but we can't do that from a Power BI report just yet. Okay, it's been on the roadmap for about 2 years now, right? It's coming, they tell us. Okay, so that is artifacts, questions on artifacts. Very knowledgeable, have I confused you? I don't think so, because this is not too hard, or is it just everybody knows? Yes?
Can you say something about apps?
No, I can't. No, Microsoft wants you to use them. It's not necessarily an administrative feature. It's more of I don't want to say. So some organizations actually have a app-only approach, right? Oh, yes. Okay, so the question is, can I say something about apps? Okay, so Power BI has this notion of apps where I can take a set of reports within a workspace and I can make that selection publishable as an app to an audience, okay? A lot of companies use that as all of our content must be distributed that way. It has a lot of advantages. It makes some of the deployments easier. Sometimes it adds some complexity. Yes? So the question is, can we have administrators and members basically, but the contributors cannot publish the apps? I think that actually is a feature. I think contributors cannot actually do that. Huh? Contributor can't publish the app. I think that almost by definition that is. I do have a terrible slide on that. I just copied and pasted it from the Microsoft site. So we have a whole bunch of features that are available to members only, and I think share items in an app. So that's just terrible. But there, basically only those 2 roles would be able to do that anyway. So I think that's describing exactly what you're asking. Okay. 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 Data. Okay. How much time we got? Oh, I got to watch 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, so when it comes to data, we're not speaking about developing the data portion itself. Okay, we are referring here to the management of that data, and really when it comes to Power BI, that is the management of the gateway. Okay, now why do we use gateways? The first reason is that a lot of our data still sits within our corporate infrastructure. Okay, so it's actually not accessible. When we use Power BI, or when a Power BI data model refreshes, it forms a connection to the data source. Now, if you've got a database sitting in Azure, that works well, right? Because they're visible, or they possibly are visible. Okay, but perhaps you've set up your networking differently. If you've got an enterprise, you don't want to allow incoming connections. Okay, that would just be a bad practice. So instead what we do is we use a gateway, which forms an outgoing connection. So we install a process that runs on a local machine, and that reaches out to the Power BI service, okay, in an authenticated, secure process. Okay, by default that uses SSL, and it handles all of those data requests. So every time the service needs data, it actually, the gateway polls the service, says, do you need any more data? The process will then say, okay, cool, you need the new employee table. It'll then go and prepare that data table and bring it back. So there's a couple of things that we need to know about the gateway. In fact, I've got a slide about the structure. Sorry, okay, no, sorry, let me just actually make it visible. It helps if you do that. Unhide slide, F5. Okay, so the way the gateway works is essentially we've got those on-prem data sources. Okay, so that can be SQL, SharePoint, another service, or whatever it is. We've got that gateway agent that gets installed. We've then got the gateway cloud service. So this is the thing that manages jobs. And we've got an Azure Service Bus. An Azure Service Bus is the thing that handles messages, okay? So, and then we form that secure connection. So it's important to understand that that is a secure pipe. So all of your data is effectively secure. If you needed an additional layer of security, you didn't want that traffic getting routed over the public internet, you could use something like ExpressRoute, right? That is another expensive option, so most of us don't use it, but it is there if you do. Okay, so we've got this gateway. It sort of runs under or there's two types of gateway. There's the personal gateway. Personal gateway is really useful for getting started quickly, but it lacks a couple of features, specifically the ability to form a cluster. Okay, because we want to make sure that our data is highly available. If one node goes down, we don't want our reporting solution to be broken. So the enterprise gateway, or the standard gateway they call it nowadays, actually allows us to create these clusters. But there's a couple of functionalities, most particularly if I want to use things like R or Python as a data source, I have to be using the personal gateway. Okay, so there's a bit of a contradiction between using, how do we use Python as an enterprise? That is not necessarily straightforward. Okay, so a couple of suggestions with the gateway. First thing, we want to install as a cluster when we can. We want to keep it as close to the resources as we can. This is, it needs to go in a VM that's in your data center. It shouldn't be running in a user desktop that accesses the data center over a VPN, right? That experience is going to be terrible if that's how you're doing it. Okay, we also want to minimize the use of personal gateways. As we said, that they lack a lot of the enterprise features that enterprises need. And then we need to ensure adequate resources. If you're processing, or has anybody tried to build a large model on a laptop with like 4 gigs of RAM or 2 gigs of RAM? It's a terrible experience. But that's what's going to happen on your gateway, right? So if you under-resource your gateway, it's going to take forever to process. So you need to make sure that that gateway or that machine has enough resources to process multiple data sets concurrently, because it can actually be processing a lot of data sets for your organization at the same time. There's a whole bunch of monitoring that comes with this as well, that's available through the sort of Power BI portal. Through the little app, the sort of gateway app. Okay, questions on the gateway? Yes? You need the balance. You need both, right? Chances are it needs a lot of memory. Otherwise, it pages to disk. Okay, so I would say memory is probably the most important. But if it's under but you need to find that balance, right? And you can use basic performance stats on the machine to understand what's under strain. Oh, okay. The question was: is memory more important or is CPU more important? You're using that a lot, huh? Huh? It's usually my job to wave that at the people, so I know. Yes?
Is there a way to have an overview of all the personal gateways?
Yes, through you can get a lot of that stuff, both through the APIs, which we're going to go into right now, and through some of the reports that will give you access to that. Okay, so we spoke about you've seen me use the portal so far, and that's been all right for simple tasks, okay? If I need to go and assign rights to one user group, that really took 20 seconds. Again, the scenario, I've got 10,000 workspaces. I need to add the new Power BI administrator to these groups. I'm not going to, well, that's a nice induction for him, right? You make him do that. He'll figure out how to automate that task very quickly. But yeah, so how do we go and automate some of these tasks? And to do that, Power BI has the Power BI REST APIs. So REST is just a way of communicating with the service. It generally uses something like JavaScript to communicate messages. So we'll hit an endpoint, we'll provide a set of parameters, and it'll give us a JSON object back. Okay, now, honestly, it can be a little bit complex to use if you are not a developer. Okay, there's a lot of, I don't know how to use OAuth, I don't know how to use a web client, I don't know how to use all of these things. Okay, so Microsoft have made this easier. Most of us who are administrators know PowerShell. Who knows of PowerShell here? So what have you see? Okay, but that's the idea. So a lot of people do know PowerShell. So Microsoft have wrapped a lot of these functions within PowerShell. And I'm just going to start off on this little slide. Okay, so this is, to get going, very simple to install. You install module, name Microsoft Power BI Management. Now that'll install all of the commandlets for us. But perhaps you actually only need to install a subset. So this is maybe useful if for sort of deployment scenarios. Okay, CI/CD, I want to make that as fast as possible. I'm only going to load the modules that I want. There's a couple of others that are important. I think the one that's probably the most useful is this get commandlet. So this will list all of the commands that we have available. So you can see here's an example. So I can get Power BI capacities. I can get Power BI workspace migration status, right? I can get all of these things. Okay, authentication happens in one of two ways. One is we use authentication like we do. So if you're using this in an interactive fashion, we're going to do it like that. We're just going to run that service. It's going to bring up the sort of Microsoft single sign-on sort of process. We're going to authenticate. If I require two-factor authentication, it's going to do that. This is all configured in Azure Active Directory. It has now gone and created a token for me, but I don't need to know what a token is, right? And if you're an administrator or if you're not a developer, that's really handy. Okay, but I can also go and use service principals. So if I need to automate this task, I need it to run every hour, I need to run overnight. I don't want to be doing this manually, right? It's a great way to get job security, not a great way to live your life. But we can actually go and create a little API, which is sort of like a new version of a service account, right? So it's a username and password that we can then go and use to access these services. But before we can do this, we needed to go back to that tenant setting. Remember that we set right in the beginning. We need to make sure that we have enabled the service principals to access the APIs, okay? We also need to make sure that they can access the admin APIs. Okay, so admin APIs are a special segment of APIs that allow administrators to come and see all the workspaces. You might have noticed that as a user, I only see the workspaces that have been assigned to me. But administrators need to kind of see all of them, right? Okay, they don't necessarily need to have the permission to access them, but often we just need visibility. Okay, so we've got those, we've got that access. We can do basic commands. So I can get a list of workspaces within my tenant. I think I have about 40 of them. Okay, I can run more complicated commands in PowerShell. So this is just going to say, go and grab me all of those workspaces and give me their names and their GUIDs. Okay, nothing particularly fancy there, but then I can get a count of them. So let's go and load that into a variable and go and get a count, and you can see that I have 55 workspaces. Okay, so that's kind of handy, right? Because then I can start doing slightly more custom things. I can go over, and this is an example of using a commandlet where Power BI doesn't actually have, or there is no commandlet to perform this functionality. So there's a commandlet that actually allows us to sort of create these just to use that REST method, right? So we can use any of those APIs without that commandlet having access. And in this case, what it does is it goes and adds my colleague Neville, and it goes and adds him to all of the workspaces that meet some criteria. I'm not going to run that, just a little bit slow. Are we running out of time? We've got like 1 minute, okay. So the one I think we spoke about monitoring earlier, and what you really, probably the most important commandlet is this guy over here. Okay, the get Power BI activities. And what this is going to do is this creates a log of every action that has happened within your tenant, whether that is somebody viewed a report, whether they created it, they changed a name, data set refreshed, whatever those things are, this data set has all of those information. Now, all of this information is only available for a limited amount of time. So what you want to do is you want to build a little job that goes and downloads this periodically. Okay? Now this thing can get very big. You know, my tenant's not so big, so I could download it in about 5 minutes. If you have an extremely large tenant, this thing could actually time out. So perhaps what you want to do is you want to incrementally download these every hour. You give it a from and a to, a start time and an end time, and you download the activity log for that. Okay, and then you're going to augment that. You can drop it into a lake, and you can build the fancy things that everybody else at this conference is speaking about, and you can build that reporting. If you don't have the time for that, okay, and so show you one last thing before we wrap up. Not that. Okay, oh, sorry. I didn't, good thing I had a screenshot of it. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, so a guy named Rui Romano, who's part of the Power BI CAT team, actually built a lot of this infrastructure for you. So he has a GitHub repo where he's built all of this code for you. It goes and connects to everything, downloads it to a local storage account, and then he builds a Power BI report on top of it. And then you can sort of access all of your data from there. So this is a really cool way to get going. If you don't want to build that, you can obviously go and use third-party suppliers. Power BI Sentinel, who are actually a sponsor here as well, make a paid service that does a lot of this and more. All right, so we are out of time. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them, and good luck.